Addison arrived first, looking polished as always in her designer jeans and cashmere sweater. She kissed my cheek, but it felt perfunctory, like a social obligation. Marcus followed, already checking his phone as he walked through the door. "So, what's this about, Dad?" Addison settled into the chair across from me while Marcus remained standing by the window, still scrolling through his phone. I took a deep breath. I'm in financial trouble. The pension isn't covering everything anymore, and I've burned through most of my savings. I need help with the rent this month. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my daughter's face carefully, hoping to see compassion, concern, the love I remembered from when she was young. Instead, I saw calculation. Marcus finally looked up from his phone. "How much are we talking about?" $800? Just this month until I can figure something out. Marcus let out a short laugh. 800? Jesus, Lawrence, what have you been spending money on? I flinched at his tone. Just living expenses. The utilities went up. And the doctor bills from last month when I had that chest pain. You never told me about chest pain, Addison said, but her voice held accusation rather than concern, as if I was keeping things from her deliberately. I didn't want to worry you. Marcus rolled his eyes. Look, old man, we're not a bank. Maybe you should look into senior housing or something. You can't expect us to bail you out every time you can't manage your money. The words hit me like a physical blow. Old man? Not Dad, not Lawrence, but old man, spoken with such casual disrespect that I felt my hands tremble. Addison didn't correct him. She just sat there, nodding slightly as if she agreed. I'm not asking for a bailout, I said quietly, fighting to keep my voice steady. I'm asking my family for help during a difficult time. Marcus walked over to where Addison was sitting, placing his hand on her shoulder in a gesture that felt possessive rather than supportive. Addison, we talked about this. We can't keep enabling this kind of dependency. Enabling. Dependency. As if asking my own daughter for help was some kind of character flaw. Dad, Addison said, her voice taking on the patient tone you'd use with a difficult child. Maybe Marcus is right. Maybe it's time to consider your options. There are some very nice assisted living places that work with Medicare. You might be happier around people your own age. I stared at her, this woman who had once been the little girl who climbed into my lap every night for bedtime stories, who had called me her hero when I taught her to ride a bike, who had cried in my arms when her first boyfriend broke her heart. I don't want to live in assisted living, I said. I want to stay in my home. I just need help with 1 month's rent. Marcus pulled out his phone again. Look, we've got to go. Figure it out. Lawrence, you're a grown man. Time to act like it. Figure it out. Those 3 words echoed in my mind as they gathered their things and headed for the door. No offer of help, no suggestion of compromise, no recognition that I was their family. At the door, Addison turned back. For a moment, I thought she might reconsider, might remember who I was to her. Instead, she said, Dad, you really need to start thinking about your future more realistically. We can't be responsible for your choices. After they left, I sat in that empty living room for a long time, Margaret's picture on the mantel the only witness to my humiliation. But as the shock faded, something else took its place. Not just hurt, but a cold, clear understanding. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Peterson and Associates, Mr. Peterson's office. This is Lawrence Mitchell. I need to speak with James immediately. Tell him it's time to prepare the envelope. The test was over. Now it was time for the truth. The days following that conversation blurred together in a haze of disappointment and growing dread. I kept thinking about Addison's words, the way she'd looked at me like I was a problem to be solved rather than her father. But what haunted me most was the silence that followed Marcus's cruel dismissal. My daughter hadn't defended me, hadn't shown even a flicker of the loyalty I'd spent 38 years nurturing. I didn't sleep much that week. Instead, I found myself walking through the house at odd hours, touching the furniture Margaret and I had chosen together, looking at photos of happier times. In one picture, Addison couldn't have been more than 5 years old, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair, both of us laughing at something Margaret had said behind the camera. The little girl in that photo loved her daddy unconditionally. I wondered when that had died. 3 days after their visit, Addison called. I answered hopefully, thinking perhaps she'd had time to reconsider, that her conscience had finally spoken up. Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation. Oh. Marcus and I found a place that might be perfect for you. Sunset Manor. It's a really nice assisted living facility about 20 minutes from here. They have activities, meals are included, and the staff is trained to help with medications and daily care. My heart sank. Edison, I told you I don't want to leave my home. But Dad, be practical. You can't afford the rent, you just said so. This way you'd have security and we wouldn't have to worry about you struggling financially. We wouldn't have to worry. Not we could help you, not we want to support you, but we wouldn't have to worry. As if I was an inconvenience they needed to warehouse somewhere safe. What about this house? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Well, obviously you'd sell it. The equity could help pay for the assisted living fees for a few years. Marcus looked up the property values in your neighborhood, and you should get enough to cover at least 3 years at Sunset Manor, maybe 4 if you're careful. Marcus had looked up property values. My son-in-law had spent time researching how to liquidate my life rather than figuring out how to help me keep it. I don't want to sell the house, Edison. This is where your mother and I built our life together. This is where you grew up. There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice had an edge of frustration. Dad, you're being sentimental. It's just a house. Mom is gone and I don't live there anymore. You're holding on to something that doesn't make sense financially. Just a house. The place where I'd carried her over the threshold as a newborn, where I'd paced the floors when she had pneumonia at age 7, where Margaret and I had celebrated our anniversaries and holidays and ordinary Tuesday evenings that had made up the fabric of our happiness. Just a house. I need some time to think, I managed to say. Don't take too long, Dad. These places fill up fast, and if you wait, you might end up somewhere not as nice. That evening, I sat on the front porch as the sun went down, something Margaret and I had done almost every evening for 15 years. The neighborhood was quiet, families inside having dinner, children doing homework, the normal rhythm of life continuing around me while my world seemed to be dissolving. That's when I saw Marcus's car pull up. He got out alone, his face set with the kind of determination I recognized from my years in business. Someone coming to close a deal they considered already won. He knocked on my front door, then let himself in when I didn't answer immediately. Lawrence, we need to talk. I found him in my living room, standing by the mantel, looking at the family photos with what seemed like impatience. Marcus? I kept my voice neutral, though seeing him in my space without Addison felt like an invasion. Look, I'm going to be straight with you because I don't think Addison wants to say what needs to be said. He turned to face me, his expression a mixture of condescension and irritation. This whole situation is getting out of hand. What situation? You calling us every time you have a financial problem, expecting us to bail you out. It's not fair to Addison, and it's not sustainable. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I asked for help once, Marcus, one time. This time. But what about next month? And the month after that? You think we don't see what's happening here. You're sliding downhill, and you want to drag us down with you. His words were like slaps, each one calculated to diminish me. I'm not trying to drag anyone down. I'm trying to stay in my home. Marcus laughed, and it was a sound devoid of any warmth. This place. Lawrence, look around. The carpet is 20 years old. The kitchen hasn't been updated since the 80s, and the whole house probably needs new plumbing. You're sitting on a money pit, trying to maintain something you can't afford out of stubborn pride. He walked over to the window, looking out at the yard where Margaret's rose bushes still bloomed. And don't think we don't know what you're really doing. Playing the poor old widower, trying to make Addison feel guilty so she'll take care of you. It's manipulative, and it's not going to work. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. That's not what I'm doing. Isn't it? He turned back to me, his eyes cold. You raised one daughter, Lawrence. Your job is done. Now it's time to act like an adult and handle your own problems instead of guilting your kid into being your caretaker. I opened my mouth to respond, but he held up a hand. I'm not done. Let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to sell this house and move into assisted living like a reasonable person. Or you're going to figure out your money problems on your own. But you're not going to keep calling my wife every time you can't pay your bills. My wife? Not your daughter, not Edison, but my wife? As if he was staking a claim, making it clear where her loyalties lay. Does Edison know you're here? I asked. Marcus shrugged. She knows I was going to have a man-to-man conversation with you. She's tired of being in the middle, Lawrence. Tired of feeling guilty every time you call with some new crisis. He headed toward the door, then paused. One more thing. If you're thinking about trying to guilt-trip her with some story about being your daughter and owing you something, save it. She doesn't owe you anything for doing what parents are supposed to do. You chose to have a kid. You chose to raise her. That was your responsibility, not her debt to pay back. After he left, I sat in my chair feeling like I'd been hollowed out. The cruelty of his words was one thing, but worse was the realization that he felt comfortable saying them. He wasn't worried about my reaction, wasn't concerned about Edison's anger if she found out how he'd spoken to me. Because he knew she wouldn't be angry. He knew she agreed with him. I picked up Margaret's picture from the side table, tracing her face with my finger. They don't know who I am, I whispered to her. They think I'm just some helpless old man they need to manage. For the first time since that night, I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, wasn't filled with humor or joy. It was the smile of a man who had just realized he'd been playing a game where only he didn't know the rules. I reached for my phone and dialed James Peterson's direct line. Again, James, it's Lawrence. We need to move up our timeline. I want that meeting tomorrow. The test was revealing more than I'd imagined. Soon it would be time for the results. The offices of Peterson and Associates occupied the top 3 floors of the Meridian building downtown, overlooking the city I had helped build decades ago. As I rode the elevator to the 32nd floor, I caught my reflection in the polished steel doors. Grey-haired, wearing my usual khaki pants and polo shirt from the discount store, I looked exactly like what Marcus had called me. Just another old man. If only he knew. James Peterson had been my attorney for over 25 years, though few people knew about our relationship. He was one of the handful of people who understood exactly who Lawrence Mitchell really was, and more importantly, who he had been. Lawrence. James stood as I entered his corner office, extending his hand with the warmth reserved for old friends. At 72, he was 7 years my senior, but moved with the energy of someone much younger. Success had been kind to him, as it had been to me, though I had chosen a very different path for displaying mine. James, thank you for seeing me so quickly. He gestured to the leather chairs by his window, the same chairs where we'd planned my retirement strategy 15 years ago. The city spread out below us, a testament to the empire I'd built and then deliberately obscured. You said it was time for the envelope. His voice was serious now. Are you certain about this? I nodded, settling into the familiar chair. The test has run its course. I know everything I need to know. James walked to his massive safe, the kind that required both a combination and his fingerprint. From inside, he withdrew a manila envelope, thick with documents that would change everything. But he didn't hand it over immediately. Tell me what happened. So I did. I told him about Edison's coldness, about Marcus's cruelty, about being called old man in my own home by a man who had married into my family and decided I was expendable. James listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. The boy doesn't know who he's dealing with, James said finally. No, he doesn't. And that's exactly how I wanted it. I closed my eyes, letting myself remember the man I used to be, the life I'd led before I chose simplicity over spectacle. 43 years ago, I started Mitchell Construction with nothing but a pickup truck, a set of tools, and an unshakable belief that I could build something lasting. Margaret and I were newlyweds then, living in a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery, dreaming of the family we'd have and the life we'd create together. Those early years were brutal, 18-hour days, bidding on jobs that barely covered expenses, competing against established companies that had been in business for generations. But I had something they didn't. Hunger. Not just for money, but for the satisfaction of creating something permanent, something that would outlast me. The first big break came when the city needed emergency repairs on the Riverside Bridge after a storm damaged the supports. Every major contractor said it couldn't be done in the time frame required. I said it could, and I delivered 3 days ahead of schedule. That project led to another, then another, and within 5 years, Mitchell Construction was bidding on projects worth millions. But it was the decision to expand into commercial development that really changed everything. While other contractors were content to build what others designed, I started creating entire projects from the ground up. Office complexes, shopping centers, residential developments that transformed empty lots into communities. By the time Addison was born, we owned 37 properties across 4 states. By her 10th birthday, that number had grown to over 200. Hotels, apartment buildings, strip malls, office towers. If it was built in the southeastern United States between 1975 and 2005, there was a good chance Mitchell Construction had a hand in it. The money came faster than we could spend it. Margaret and I bought the big house in Elmwood Heights, the one with 8 bedrooms and a circular driveway, the pool and the tennis court that Addison loved so much. We had the vacation home in Aspen, the beach house in Hilton Head, cars that cost more than most people's annual salaries. But success came with a price I hadn't anticipated. The bigger we got, the more time I spent away from home. Board meetings, site inspections, negotiations that stretched into the night. I missed Addison's school plays, her soccer games, the 1,000 small moments that make up a childhood. Margaret never complained, but I could see the strain. She managed our social calendar, the charity events, the dinner parties that were really business meetings disguised as entertainment. She raised our daughter largely alone while I built an empire that was supposed to secure our future. The wake-up call came on Addison's 16th birthday. I had promised to be home for her party, had even told my assistant to clear my schedule. But a crisis at a job site in Atlanta demanded my attention, and I convinced myself that one day wouldn't matter, that there would be other birthdays. When I finally made it home that night, the house was dark except for the kitchen light. Margaret was sitting at the counter, still in her party dress, cleaning up the remnants of a celebration I had missed. "How was the party?" I asked, kissing her cheek. She looked at me with eyes that held more sadness than anger. "She asked me to save you a piece of cake. She kept checking the door, thinking you'd surprise her." I found Addison in her room, already in pajamas, pretending to read a magazine. When I apologized and offered to take her shopping the next day to make up for missing her party, she just shrugged. "It's fine, Dad. I know work is more important." That sentence haunted me for weeks. Work is more important. My 16-year-old daughter had learned to expect disappointment from me, had accepted that her father's priorities didn't include her. That night I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I was going to step back, not retire completely, but delegate more, travel less, be present for what mattered. Margaret and I talked about it for hours, planning how I would transition from hands-on management to strategic oversight, but life had other plans. 6 months later, Margaret was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. At 52, the woman who had managed our social calendar, who remembered everyone's birthdays and anniversaries, who could recite phone numbers and addresses from memory, began forgetting simple words. Within a year, she sometimes didn't recognize me. I sold Mitchell Construction in 2006 for $347 million. The new owners kept the name and most of the staff, but I was done. My focus shifted entirely to Margaret's care and trying to rebuild my relationship with Addison before it was too late. The big house in Elmwood Heights went first. Too many rooms, too many memories of parties and gatherings that would never happen again. We moved to the modest 2-bedroom house where I still lived, choosing simplicity over grandeur. The vacation homes were sold, the expensive cars replaced with reliable sedans. To the outside world, it looked like we were downsizing because of Margaret's illness, scaling back to manage medical expenses. I did nothing to correct that impression. In fact, I encouraged it. The money from the business sale was invested conservatively, managed by a discreet firm that James recommended. By the time Margaret passed 3 years ago, that $347 million had grown to just over $430 million. Add the rental income from properties I'd kept in other companies' names, and my current net worth was approximately $463 million. But to my daughter and son-in-law, I was just an old man living on a pension in a small house, struggling to pay my $800 rent. The irony, I told James, is that they're planning my future based on a complete fiction. They think they're making practical decisions about a poor old widower who can't manage his finances. James shook his head. What they're really planning is how to warehouse you somewhere convenient so they don't have to deal with you. Exactly. I reached for the envelope. Marcus made it very clear that I'm a burden, that my time as a father is over, that I need to stop expecting support from my family. And now, I opened the envelope, scanning the documents inside. Financial statements, property deeds, investment portfolios. The complete picture of exactly who Lawrence Mitchell really was. Now they're going to learn that some burdens are more expensive than others. James leaned forward. Are you sure you want to do this? Once you show them these documents, there's no going back. Your relationship with Addison. My relationship with Addison died the night she let Marcus call me an old man in my own living room and said nothing. I closed the envelope. The question now is whether she learns who I really am before or after she completely burns the bridge between us. I stood to leave, envelope in hand. James, I want you to call them. Tell them you're my attorney and that you have documents regarding my estate that require immediate discussion. Schedule a meeting for tomorrow evening at 7. At your house? Yes, let them come to me one more time. Let them sit in my living room, thinking they're about to get some sad old man's meager possessions sorted out. James smiled, the first genuine warmth I'd seen from him all day. It's going to be quite a shock. Good, they've earned it. As I drove home through the city I'd helped build, past buildings that still bore my company's signature, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: anticipation. Tomorrow the test would be complete. Tomorrow they would learn exactly what kind of man they had decided to throw away. The only question was whether it would change anything at all. The knock on my door came at exactly 7 o'clock. Through the window I watched Addison and Marcus walk up my front path, their body language telling me everything I needed to know about their expectations. Addison clutched her purse tightly, her face wearing that patient expression she'd perfected for dealing with what she considered my unreasonable behavior. Marcus checked his phone one last time before sliding it into his pocket, with an air of barely contained irritation. They thought they were coming to discuss my modest estate planning, maybe help their poor old father figure out his final wishes for his small house and whatever meager savings he might have accumulated. They had no idea they were walking into a reckoning 20 years in the making. Dad. Addison kissed my cheek perfunctorily as she entered. You said your lawyer needed to meet with us. James is running a few minutes late, I said, gesturing toward the living room. Can I get you anything? Coffee? Water? Marcus was already examining the room with the calculating gaze I'd seen before, probably assessing the value of my furniture for estate sale purposes. We're fine. Let's just get this over with. Addison has book club tonight. Book club. My daughter had somewhere more important to be than discussing her father's final arrangements. The casual dismissal might have hurt a week ago. Now it just confirmed everything I'd learned about who she'd become. We sat in our familiar positions, Addison and Marcus on the couch, me in my recliner, the coffee table between us like a battle line. The envelope lay on that table, innocent-looking manila, paper that would detonate their carefully constructed assumptions about my life. 5 minutes later, James arrived. I watched Addison and Marcus straighten slightly as he entered, recognizing expensive tailoring and the confidence that came with significant success. James Peterson didn't look like the kind of lawyer who handled simple wills for retired blue-collar workers. Thank you both for coming, James said, settling into the chair I'd positioned across from the couch. He placed his briefcase beside him but didn't open it immediately. I'm James Peterson, and I've been Mr. Mitchell's attorney for over 25 years. Marcus frowned. 25 years? Dad, you never mentioned having a lawyer. I said nothing. James continued smoothly. We're here today to discuss some important matters regarding Lawrence's estate and financial situation. Given recent circumstances, he felt it was time for family members to understand the complete picture. Addison leaned forward. Is this about the assisted living discussion? Because we've found a really nice place that would work well within Dad's budget. That's interesting, James said, his tone carefully neutral. What budget did you calculate for your father? Marcus answered with the confidence of someone who'd clearly done research. Well, if he sells this house, he should clear maybe 80 to 90,000 after paying off the mortgage. Social Security and his pension probably give him around $1,800 a month, so maybe $150,000 total to work with for care costs. James nodded thoughtfully. I see. And you base these calculations on what information? Common sense, Marcus said, his voice carrying that edge of impatience I'd grown to despise. Look around. This isn't exactly a mansion. The guy's been struggling to pay his rent. Marcus. Addison's voice held a warning, but it was too late. The mask had already slipped. James opened his briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. Before we proceed, I need to ask you both something important. Have either of you made any financial commitments or legal arrangements based on your assumptions about Lawrence's economic situation? They exchanged glances. What do you mean? Addison asked. Have you signed any papers, put deposits down on assisted living facilities, made any decisions that would be difficult to reverse? We toured Sunset Manor, Addison said slowly. They want a $5,000 deposit to hold a room, but we haven't paid it yet. We wanted to make sure Dad was on board first. That's fortunate, James said, because you're going to want to cancel that tour. He opened the folder and withdrew the first document. Let's start with a basic financial statement. I watched their faces as James placed the paper on the coffee table, positioned so they could both see it clearly. The letterhead was from Meridian Wealth Management, one of the most prestigious investment firms in the country. Below that, in stark black numbers, was a summary that would change everything. Lawrence Mitchell. Portfolio summary. Current total assets, $463,752,412.18. Addison blinked, staring at the paper as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. This can't be right. Marcus leaned forward, grabbing the document. This is some kind of mistake. $400 million. That's impossible. James withdrew another document. Real estate holdings summary. He placed it beside the first paper. Property portfolio. Lawrence Mitchell. Meridian Office Complex, Atlanta. Valued at $37 million. Riverside Shopping Center, Charleston. Valued at $29 million. Highland Residential Development. Augusta. Valued at $43 million. Stone Creek Hotel Group. 6 properties. Combined value $112 million. The list continued for 2 full pages. Addison's hands were shaking now. Dad, what is this? I don't understand. I finally spoke, my voice calm and measured. It's exactly what it looks like, Addison. It's my net worth. Marcus shot to his feet. This is bullshit. You've been lying to us. Have I? I stood as well, meeting his angry glare. When did I ever tell you I was poor? When did I ever claim to be struggling financially? You asked us for $800. I asked you for help. There's a difference. James continued placing documents on the table. Bank statements showing balances in the tens of millions. Investment portfolios spanning decades. Property deeds for buildings they'd probably shopped in without knowing I owned them. The Mitchell Construction Company sale in 2006. James explained, his voice professorially calm. $347 million. Lawrence invested the proceeds conservatively. With compound growth and rental income from retained properties, his current net worth exceeds $460 million. Addison was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she stared at the documents scattered across my coffee table. You let us think you were poor. You let Marcus talk to you like a useless old man who needed to figure out his own problems. I finished for her. Yes, I did. Marcus was pacing now, his face red with anger and what I was beginning to recognize as panic. You played us. This whole thing was some kind of sick game. No, Marcus, this was a test, and you both failed spectacularly. James withdrew the final document from his folder. This is Lawrence's current will, updated 3 days ago. The silence in the room was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, the sound of cars passing outside, the whispered sounds of a neighborhood going about its evening routine while my living room became the site of my family's destruction. The bulk of the estate, James continued, $430 million has been designated for charitable giving. the Lawrence and Margaret Mitchell Foundation, which will focus on elder care advocacy and support for seniors aging in place. Addison's sobbing grew louder. Dad, please, I don't understand why you're doing this. Don't you? I sat back down, suddenly feeling every one of my 65 years. 3 days ago, you couldn't spare $800 to help your father keep his home. Your husband called me a useless old man and told me to figure out my own problems. You suggested I sell the house where your mother and I built our life together so I could be warehoused in assisted living. We didn't know, she whispered. You didn't care, I corrected. You didn't know because you never bothered to find out. You assumed I was a burden and treated me accordingly. Marcus had stopped pacing. Okay, look, maybe we reacted badly, but you can't cut your own daughter out of your will over one conversation. One conversation? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Marcus, you've been treating me like an inconvenience since the day you married my daughter. You've made it clear that you consider me a burden, that my time as a father is over, that I should just disappear quietly and stop bothering you. I gestured toward the documents covering my table. Well, congratulations, you're about to get exactly what you wanted. Addison looked up at me, her makeup ruined, her composure completely shattered. What do you mean? James answered for me. The will makes provisions for a modest inheritance, $50,000 each. The rest goes to charity. $50,000. Less than what I spent on Marcus's wedding gift 5 years ago. Less than I'd given them for their anniversary trip to Europe. Less than I would have spent on their children's education if they'd ever bothered to have any. Marcus sank back onto the couch as if his legs had given out. You're really going to give away almost $500 million to strangers instead of your own family? I'm giving it to people who actually need it, I said. People who understand the value of help when it's offered. People who don't call their benefactors useless old men. The weight of their realization was settling over them now. Not just the money they'd lost, but the magnitude of their misjudgment. They had treated a man worth nearly $500 million like a burden, had planned to warehouse him in budget-assisted living, had dismissed his request for help with the casual cruelty of people who considered themselves superior. Dad, Addison whispered, what can we do to fix this? I looked at her for a long moment, this woman who had once been the center of my world, who had called me her hero and meant it. I don't think you can, sweetheart. Some things once broken can't be repaired. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of choices that couldn't be undone and words that couldn't be taken back. Finally, James began collecting the documents. I think we've covered everything that needed to be discussed tonight. As they prepared to leave, Marcus turned back one final time. His anger had faded, replaced by something that looked almost like desperation. Lawrence, you can't be serious about this. We're your family. I met his eyes steadily. No, Marcus. Family doesn't call each other useless. Family doesn't abandon each other when times get tough. You made it very clear what kind of family we are. After they left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the echoes of their shock and grief. The test was complete, and the results were exactly what I'd feared they would be. But knowing the truth, as painful as it was, felt better than living with the illusion. The phone started ringing at 6:30 the next morning. I let it go to voicemails and listened to Addison's voice break as she pleaded with me to call her back, to give them another chance, to reconsider what she called this terrible misunderstanding. Misunderstanding. As if discovering that your father is worth nearly $500 million somehow excused calling him a useless old man? By noon there had been 17 calls. I deleted most without listening, but a few were too pathetic to ignore. Marcus, trying to sound reasonable, explaining that they'd just been looking out for my best interests when they suggested assisted living. Addison sobbing through an explanation about how much stress she'd been under at work, how that had affected her judgment. None of them addressed the fundamental issue. They had been willing to discard me when they thought I was poor and helpless. The knock on my door came at 2 o'clock. Through the window I saw both of them standing on my porch, but they looked different. Addison had clearly been crying for hours, her eyes swollen and red. Marcus stood beside her with the defeated posture of a man whose carefully constructed world had just collapsed. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. "Dad, please," Addison said immediately. "We need to talk. We talked last night. That wasn't talking, that was ambush. Marcus stepped forward, his voice carrying a desperate edge I'd never heard before. You set us up to fail. Did I? I remained in the doorway, making them stand on the porch like unwelcome solicitors. I asked my family for help with $800. How was that setting you up? You know what I mean, Marcus said. You pretended to be someone you're not. I never pretended anything. I live quietly, I dress simply, I drive an older car. None of that was pretense. That's just how I choose to live. Addison pulled a tissue from her purse, dabbing at her eyes. But you let us believe you were struggling. You assumed I was struggling because I don't live like you think rich people should live. You never asked about my finances. You never showed any interest in who I really was. The truth hung between us like a wall. They had been so convinced of my poverty that they'd never questioned their assumptions. Never wondered why a man who'd run a successful construction company for decades would be genuinely destitute. Can we please come inside? Addison asked. The neighbors are watching. I stepped aside, but reluctantly. In the living room, they sat on the edge of the couch like supplicants, while I remained standing by the window. Dad, I know we made mistakes, Addison began. But cutting us out of your will completely, that's not the father I remember. The father you remember disappeared a long time ago, Addison. Sometime around when you stopped calling unless you needed something. Around when you started letting your husband treat me like an embarrassment. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Look, I admit I could have been more respectful, but you have to understand our position. We thought we were dealing with a stubborn old man who couldn't accept reality. And what reality was that? That you were declining. Financially, maybe mentally. We were trying to help. I laughed, a sound without humor. Help? You were trying to warehouse me somewhere convenient so you wouldn't have to deal with me anymore? That's not true, Addison protested, but her voice lacked conviction. I walked to the mantel and picked up a small wooden box I kept there, something they'd probably assumed contained Margaret's jewelry or old photos. Inside were audio recordings, digital files on a small device James had provided years ago. Would you like to hear what help sounds like? I pressed play on the first recording. Marcus's voice filled the room, tinny but clear. Look, we both know the old man is losing it. The sooner we get him into assisted living, the sooner we can sell that house and not have to worry about him anymore. Addison gasped. Dad, where did you get that? Your living room, I said simply. Last month, when you thought I was napping in my chair. You'd be surprised how much you can hear when people think you're asleep. I played another recording, Addison's voice this time. I love Dad, but Marcus is right. We can't keep enabling his fantasy that he can live independently forever. And honestly, the house is just sitting there, appreciating in value while he can't even afford to maintain it properly. The color drained from her face. I didn't mean what? Didn't mean that you saw me as a burden? Didn't mean that you were already planning how to liquidate my life? I played a third recording, Marcus again. The way I see it, we're doing him a favor. Assisted living will give him structure, social interaction. And if he fights us on it, well, at our age we can probably make a case for diminished capacity. Diminished capacity. They had discussed having me declared mentally incompetent if I didn't cooperate with their plans. Marcus stood up abruptly. That's enough. You were spying on us. I was protecting myself. And it's a good thing I was, because now I know exactly what kind of people you've become. Addison was crying again, but these weren't the manipulative tears she'd used the night before. These seemed genuine, born of shame rather than self-pity. Dad, we were just scared. We didn't know how to handle the situation. What situation? A father who needed $800? A father who we thought was sliding into poverty and refusing to accept help. I didn't refuse help. You refused to provide it. The distinction hung in the air between us. They had convinced themselves that their cruel dismissal was somehow in my best interest, that abandoning me was really a form of tough love. Look, Marcus said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone he probably used in business negotiations. We screwed up. I admit that. But people make mistakes when they're under stress. That doesn't mean you should punish us for the rest of our lives. Punish you? I set the recording device on the coffee table. Marcus, I'm not punishing you. I'm simply choosing to leave my money to people who actually care about others' well-being. But we're your family. Are you? Because last week when I asked my family for help, they told me to figure it out myself. They called me useless. They discussed having me declared mentally incompetent if I didn't cooperate with their plans to warehouse me. Addison looked up at me with desperate eyes. What can we do to make this right? The question I'd been dreading, because part of me, the part that remembered teaching her to ride a bicycle and reading her bedtime stories, wanted to forgive them. Wanted to believe that people could change, that the daughter I'd raised was still somewhere inside the woman sitting in my living room, but another part of me, the part that had built a business empire from nothing, knew better. I'd learned long ago that when people show you who they really are, you should believe them. I don't think you can make it right, Addison. Some things can't be undone. Marcus stood up, his frustration finally boiling over. This is insane. You're going to give away $500 million to strangers because we had one bad conversation? It wasn't one conversation, Marcus. It was years of being treated like an inconvenience. Years of watching you roll your eyes when I called. Years of feeling like my own daughter was doing me a favor by spending time with me. But we're here now, Addison said. We're trying to fix things. You're here because you found out I have money. If I were actually the poor old man you thought I was, would you be sitting in my living room right now, promising to do better? She opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. We all knew the truth. The foundation is already being established, I continued. The lawyers are drawing up the final documents. The money will go to organizations that help seniors age in place with dignity, that fight for elder rights, that provide support for people whose families have abandoned them. You're really not going to change your mind? Marcus asked. I looked at him, this man who had married my daughter and then spent 5 years treating her father like an embarrassment to be managed. Would you change your mind if you were me? He didn't answer, but his expression told me everything I needed to know. Even now, even after learning the magnitude of their mistake, he still thought I was being unreasonable. They left without another word, and I watched through the window as they walked to their car. Marcus was gesturing angrily, probably already strategizing their next move. Addison walked with the broken posture of someone whose world had just collapsed. I felt no satisfaction in their pain, but I felt no regret either. They had made their choices when they thought the consequences would never matter. Now they were learning that every choice has a price, and some prices are higher than others. The phone rang again that evening. This time it was a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Mitchell, this is Patricia Webb from Elder Care Advocacy. Mr. Peterson said you might be interested in discussing a significant donation to our organization. I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd felt in weeks. Yes, Patricia, I think it's time we talked about how to help people who really need it. As I spoke with her about the foundation, about the programs we could fund and the lives we could change, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. Purpose. My daughter and son-in-law had seen me as a burden to be managed, but there were thousands of seniors out there who needed advocates, who needed support, who deserved to age with dignity. The test was over. Now the real work could begin. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of the Lawrence and Margaret Mitchell Foundation, watching as our board approved funding for 12 new programs across 6 states. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled below us, vibrant and alive with the kind of energy I remembered from my construction days. But this was different. Better. Instead of building structures that would house businesses and generate profit, we were building something more lasting. Hope for People's Society had written off. The Atlanta program alone will serve over 300 seniors in their first year. Patricia Webb explained to the board, her presentation crisp and passionate. She had become the foundation's executive director, and in 6 months she'd accomplished more than I'd dared to hope. I nodded, making notes on the proposal. And the legal advocacy component? Fully funded. We'll have attorneys specializing in elder law available for consultation, plus a hotline for reporting abuse or neglect. Patricia's eyes met mine across the table. People like your daughter's situation. Daughter. The word still carried weight, though differently now. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Addison and Marcus were divorcing. Apparently, the stress of learning they'd thrown away nearly $500 million had tested their marriage in ways it couldn't survive. Marcus blamed Addison for not knowing about my wealth. Addison blamed Marcus for his cruelty toward me. Both were probably right. She'd called 3 more times in the past 6 months. I'd listened to the voicemails but never returned the calls. The first had been angry, accusing me of destroying her marriage and her life. The second had been bargaining, proposing that we could work together on the foundation, that she could help manage the money I was giving away. The third had been resignation, asking only that I not hate her forever. I didn't hate her. Hate required more emotional investment than I was willing to make. What I felt was something closer to indifference, the kind of neutral disregard you might have for a stranger who'd treated you poorly in a store checkout line. She was no longer a central figure in my emotional landscape. The meeting ended at 4 and I drove home through neighborhoods I'd helped develop decades ago. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and I found myself thinking about Margaret, wondering what she would have thought of the choices I'd made. She would have been proud of the foundation, I knew that. She'd always been the more charitable of the two of us, the one who remembered to send donations at Christmas, who volunteered at the food bank even when our own business demanded 18-hour days. But she would have grieved for Addison. Margaret had believed in redemption, in second chances, in the power of love to overcome almost any mistake. She might have argued for forgiveness, for finding a way to rebuild what had been broken. I pulled into my driveway, the same modest house where I'd chosen to live, simply while secretly managing hundreds of millions of dollars. The neighbors probably still thought I was a retired blue-collar worker living on Social Security. I liked it that way. Mrs. Henderson from next door was working in her garden, and she waved as I got out of the car. "Beautiful day," she called out. "It really is." I walked over to the fence that separated our yards. "How are the tomatoes coming along?" "Better than expected. I might have extras if you're interested." This was what I'd been missing during all those years of empire building. Simple human connections with people who cared about tomatoes and weather and small kindnesses. People who didn't see dollar signs when they looked at me. Inside, I made myself dinner and settled into my recliner with a book. The house was quiet except for the ticking of Margaret's clock and the distant sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening routines. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity won. "Dad, it's Addison. I got a new phone. I know you probably won't read this, but I wanted you to know something. I started volunteering at a senior center 3 days a week. I can't fix what I did to you, but maybe I can do better for other people's parents. I'm sorry it took losing you to learn what I should have known all along." I stared at the message for a long time. It was the first communication from her that hadn't asked for anything, that hadn't tried to bargain or manipulate or justify. Just an acknowledgement and an attempt to do better. I didn't respond, but I didn't delete it either. The next morning brought a call from James Peterson. "Lawrence, I wanted to give you an update on the estate planning. Everything's finalized. The foundation is legally established, the assets are transferred, and the will is ironclad. Even if you were to die tomorrow, your instructions would be carried out exactly as you specified." "Good." I poured myself a second cup of coffee, watching birds gather at the feeder Margaret had installed outside the kitchen window. "What about the $50,000 for Addison and Marcus?" "That remains unchanged. $50,000 each to be distributed upon your death. No modifications to that provision." $50,000. Not enough to change their lives significantly, but enough to serve as a permanent reminder of what their cruelty had cost them. Every time they spent $1 of that money, they'd remember that it represented roughly 1/10,000th of what they'd thrown away. "There is one other matter," James continued. "Marcus has retained an attorney. They're exploring whether they can challenge the will." I wasn't surprised. "What are their grounds?" "They're claiming undue influence, arguing that you weren't competent to make such dramatic changes to your estate planning. They're painting you as an elderly man who was taken advantage of by the foundation organizers." I laughed. "They're claiming I was manipulated into giving away my own money? It's a common strategy in estate challenges, though rarely successful. particularly when the person making the will has decades of documented business success and no medical history suggesting diminished capacity. Let them try. I have recordings of them discussing my diminished capacity as a strategy to control me. I think a judge might find that interesting. I thought you might. I'll prepare a defense that includes those recordings. After hanging up, I realized I felt no anger at Marcus's legal challenge, no anxiety about defending my choices. Let him spend his money on lawyers. Let him explain to a court why a man worth nearly $500 million should be forced to leave his fortune to people who called him useless. The irony was perfect. They were using the exact strategy they'd planned to use against me, claiming I lacked the mental capacity to make my own decisions. But now they were the ones who looked desperate and grasping. That afternoon I drove to the Oak Hill Senior Center, one of the first programs our foundation had funded. The building buzzed with activity, seniors playing cards, attending art classes, sharing meals in a bright cafeteria that felt nothing like the institutional warehouses where Edison and Marcus had wanted to store me. "Mr. Mitchell," Dorothy Chen, the center's director, greeted me warmly. "Perfect timing. I wanted to show you the new computer lab." She led me through a room where a dozen seniors were learning to video chat with grandchildren, navigate social media, order groceries online. Simple skills that could mean the difference between independence and isolation. "This is amazing," I said, watching an 80-year-old woman successfully place her first online grocery order. "It's all thanks to the foundation," Dorothy replied. 6 months ago, we could barely keep the lights on. Now we are serving 3 times as many people and expanding our programs monthly. As I walked through the center, talking with residents and volunteers, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The satisfaction of work that truly mattered. Not building structures or accumulating wealth, but helping people maintain their dignity and independence. An elderly man named Robert approached me as I was preparing to leave. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Mitchell from the foundation?" "I am." He shook my hand with genuine warmth. "I wanted to thank you. My daughter was trying to force me into a nursing home, said I couldn't manage on my own anymore. The legal clinic you funded helped me understand my rights. I'm still in my own apartment, still independent. You gave me back my life." Driving home, I thought about Robert's words. I'd given him back his life. How different that was from what my own family had tried to do to me. That evening, as I sat on my front porch watching the sunset, Mrs. Henderson came over with a basket of those promised tomatoes. "How was your day?" she asked, settling into the second chair I'd put on the porch. "Productive. Yours?" "Same. My grandson called to check on me. He does that every week, never misses. Says he worries about me living alone, but he respects that it's my choice." I smiled. "You raised him well. His parents did most of that. I just try not to be a burden." "You're not a burden, Eleanor. You're family." She patted my hand. "That's what he tells me. Some people are lucky with their families, I guess." After she went inside, I sat alone on the porch as darkness settled over the neighborhood. The test I'd given Addison and Marcus had revealed exactly what I'd feared it would. They saw me as an obligation rather than a person, a problem to be managed rather than a father to be loved. But it had also revealed something unexpected, that family wasn't limited to blood relations, that respect, kindness, and genuine care could be found in the most ordinary places. My phone buzzed with another text from Addison. "Dad, I know I have no right to ask this, but could we have coffee sometime? Not to talk about money or wills or any of that. Just to talk. I miss you." I stared at the message for several minutes, then slowly typed a response. "I'm sorry, Addison. I wish I could, but I'm not ready for that yet. Maybe someday." It was an honest answer. The door wasn't permanently closed, but it would take more than 6 months of volunteer work and apologetic text messages to rebuild what had been destroyed. Maybe someday she would prove that her change was genuine and lasting. Maybe someday I would be ready to risk trusting her again. But not today. Today I was content with the family I'd chosen, the foundation staff who shared my vision, the neighbors who valued simple kindness, the seniors whose lives we were helping improve. They had earned their place in my world through their actions, not their genetics. I'd spent 65 years learning that blood doesn't guarantee love, but kindness always earns it. As I prepared for bed, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. Peace. Not the temporary calm that comes from avoiding conflict, but the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've made choices you can live with. The test was over. The results were final, and for the first time in years I was exactly where I belonged.